Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. So we now move on to our first roundtable discussion of the day. So for those of you that are just joining us, my name is Sasha Kovacs, an assistant professor from the Department of Theatre at the University of Victoria, and I'm here as a moderator for this session with our esteemed panelists. The title of this session is The Place of Performance in Pacific Northwest Museums, Archives, and Galleries. And the function really of this session is to talk about the approaches to performance materials at work in the Pacific Northwest larger institutions of cultural heritage. We have 4 panelists with us today, and so I will introduce them from that side of the table to this side of the table. So Neel, thank you for being here with us, is from the Kovacs Nation and is a practicing visual artist who creates work in the Kovacs styles and traditions. Luann is also the repatriation specialist at the Royal BC Museum, working closely with communities throughout BC on the repatriation of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Thanks, Luann, for being here. To her right is Katherine Bunn-Marcuse, is the curator of Northwest Native Art and director of the Bill Holmes Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art at the Burke Museum, and assistant professor of art history at the University of Washington. Her publications focus on the indigenization of European American imagery, 19th century Northwest Coast jewelry, and other body adornment, and the filmic history of the Kovacs. In her role as curator, she collaborates with First Nations communities and artists to identify research priorities and to activate the Burke Museum's holdings in ways that are responsive to cultural revitalization efforts. To her right is Jacques, is the chief curator at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. I have a shorter bio for you, but Michelle will also introduce herself more fully in her presentation. Beside me is Lara Wilson, is the Director of Special Collections and University Archivist at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. She has held various appointments in the University of Victoria Library since 2001. Lara holds a Master of Arts, Art History and Visual Studies from the University of Victoria and a Master of Archival Studies from the University of British Columbia. She has twice served as President of the Archives Association of British Columbia, is past chairperson of the Canadian Council of Archives, and is presently serving on the boards of the Access to Memory Foundation as chair and the National Archival Appraisal Board as Director, BC and Northern Canada region. So what we've asked these folks to do today, it's a bit of maybe an unusual panel format in some ways. We've asked them some questions in advance. So I'll tell you what those questions are, and then each of these panelists has about 10 minutes that we've given them of their own airtime to respond to these questions, and then we'll engage in conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to you folks. So please do take down notes as well, things that you'd like, ways that you'd like to engage in the conversation as we move forward. So these were the questions, so that you know them. What is the role of performance in your institution's collections? Tell us about one performance-related object in your collections. Why did you choose this object? And so they may respond to one or both or some or maybe none of these questions, but just so you know, those were kind of some of the guiding prompts. So we're going to start with Katherine. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much. Let's see, does this need to come in some direction?
Yeah,
like that.
In that direction. Yeah.
How's that? Good? Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Sasha, and I want to thank Alana Lundgren as well, who I haven't even said hello to yet. Hello! I'm so looking forward to meeting you, for inviting me today. And I would like to say it's really an honor to be in Song-Usiniquet's territory on this beautiful morning. I'm a non-native settler academic. I work in Coast Salish territory, specifically Suquamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot areas in Washington, and my main research project is with the Kovacs and specifically families from Fort Rupert, Saki's Kovacs First Nation. So in being asked today about this question, well, what's one performance-related piece in your archives? It gave me a very nice intro to talk about the project that Jerry brought up, which is, well, I'll just leap in and tell you a little bit about it. So, in the Burke Museum, we have an old film that was made by Franz Boas in 1930 in the village of Southeast Fort Rupert with the participation of members of a number of families in the community, Williams, Wadhams, Knox, Johnson. There are so many. If I make a list, I will forget someone. I think many of you are very aware of where I'm talking about, northern end of Vancouver Island, so Fort Rupert, Southeast. But of course, the descendants of the people who participated in the film are now often spread across a number of Kovacs First Nations. So the film itself is about 50 minutes, and it has a whole lot of different kinds of materials that Boas and his longtime collaborator, George Hunt, were interested in recording. 1930 was Boas's last trip to the Northwest Coast. He'd been working with the Quad Youth, and particularly George Hunt and his family members, for the previous 50 years. So it's 52 minutes. It has games, children's games, some technologies like weaving and woodworking tools. And the things that have been most of interest to scholars are the recordings of dances. And so there are a number of different, about 14 different dance sequences, each about 2 minutes long. I'm not the first one to work with community members on this. This film has had a long history coming out of community and then coming back to community with various different scholars. So it was made by Boas and Hunt and all of the families that worked with them in 1930. Boas never finished his project of working with it. He gave the material to his daughter, Francisca Boas, and her history has really been well researched by Alana Lundgren. But she was not confident in finishing the project, so she sent a manuscript that she wrote on these dances back to the Burke Museum and to the then director, Erna Gunther, which is how the Burke Museum ended up with this Boas film. And then Erna Gunther didn't really know what she had, and so she, of course, had to take it back to community. And she worked with Mungo Martin, who helped to identify some of the things that were in the film, made new song recordings for some of the songs that he had seen in the film, but it was never published. And so in the 1960s, Bill Holm went to Mungo Martin and went to a number of Kovacs First Nations, showed the films, I think about 16 different times in community meetings, and gathered information on the films from some of the people who were originally in them and then their descendants as well. And it was published as a 16mm film that went out into libraries with a little typescript description of it, the manuscript that Bill Holm had read, and the libraries carefully took the film and put it on the film archive space, and the typescript maybe on another space in the library that seemed to have disappeared. So once again, it was a silent black and white film with very little understanding, because there's no interpretation of it within the film itself. So then in 2009, so it's been a while, we got the direction of the Burke Museum to please make this film more accessible. So I went back with Robin Wright to Fort Rupert. We had a community film showing, and that was the genesis of the team that I work most closely with, Caleb and Corinne and Tommy Child. And the four of us have worked on this for quite a while now. So hopefully this will work. I'll just show you a little tiny bit of it. There are many different parts of the dancing that's been recorded and analyzed, as Jerry was saying, by scholars outside of community. I don't know if this will work. Sometimes the files are so big they don't get going. There we go. So this is Bob Wilson, who is Corinne Child's grandfather. He was an incredibly talented Hamitsa dancer and owned many of the prerogatives and was related to many of the people who participated in this 1930 filming. So working with descendants of the original participants in the film is an incredibly important part of the process. And it also helps us to make sure that things like the manuscript that Francisca Boas wrote about these dances, which is fascinating in a number of ways that have to do with dance anthropology scholarship, and bizarre in the fact that she had never actually been in Kovacs territory, she had never seen anything about these dances beyond these films, and felt that she could write this manuscript about it. So we're trying to put that into context as well. All of these films are aiming for a digital publication from University of Washington Press. It's going to be open access, and it will include the films, it will include historical essays, it's going to include interviews with descendants, lots of input and participation by a number of people whose cultural heritage this is. Neel has helped in many ways. Recently we've been talking about the regalia and the aprons and other things in the film. As well, we've had a number of community film showings in Fort Rupert, so the film has gone back, been shown a number of times and many different people bring different things to it. For some, it's just like home movie night, right? You're seeing your aunts and your uncles and your great-grandparents run around, playing the games that are in the films. We're seeing this as Julia Nelson watching her mother dance. That was very important for her. And then other people bring all kinds of information. Some are really interested in who is in the film, what were they doing, what was going on in Fort Rupert, there's some images of the village, how does the beach look, and how has the water changed, and how has the little creek along the beach changed in the last 100 years. People bring all kinds of different interests, and that helped us shape what was going to go into the digital publication. One of the things that has come out of this is that when the film was examined by Erna Gunther, working with Mungo Martin and Bill Holm, working with others, there wasn't the realization that the original wax cylinder recordings, you can see this man in the background, his nickname was Long Harry, and he was singing into the phonograph. There were wax cylinder recordings made at the time, and those now live in the archives of traditional music. And so in 2011, 2010, Corinne and Caleb and I went to the archives of traditional music and listened to all the, there were 152 cylinders that Boas made in the 1930 trip, 156, sorry. And we picked out a couple of dozen that were then digitized for this project. So that was a baby song that belonged to one of Corinne's great aunts. And so some of these have been digitized, and we'll be bringing those back into the publication as well. So everybody brings their different expertise to this. I'm an art historian. My real interest is like in all of the regalia. There's not actually that much of it in the film, so I've sort of suddenly am getting immersed in all of the different parts. Tommy Child, who works with me, is really a songkeeper in his community, good at the technical side of these digital files, and as well as been working with Boas's field notebooks in the American Philosophical Society. So we have the film in the book, the Wax Cylinders Archives of Traditional Music, the field notebooks in the American Philosophical Society. He's working his way through Boas's handwriting, translating it into Kwakwala in the Umista orthography, and then really working to bring those songs back out again. He calls it ear torture. He sits there and then, slowly over the course of weeks can bring a song back into a singable place. And he has brought several of these songs back to his family and to other places. And there are many, many things that I could talk about this film. I'm going to play you one little bit so that you can see what it looks like. You see that as you see it, the beginning of this will play silently, the way it's always been sort of understood in academia and where the film has circulated, which is still small in the last couple decades, and then you'll hear the wax cylinder come in. It's not perfectly synced. They don't sync perfectly because the two machines ran at different speeds, so we'll never be able to do a perfect sound sync. So let me just play that up for you. This is just a mashup. There are other performative parts of this. You can, this Bone Cave Mahal, the gambling game, there's information around that and understanding the movements and language around the way you move your hands and the pointing directions for guessing where the bones are. There's so many parts of this, and these are just some examples. But what I want to emphasize, it's so important as institutions that we look to bring all of these fragments, and Kimberly's thesis has been so important to me in thinking about this, that are dispersed across all these different archives across the US and Canada, and bring them back into this holistic understanding, because the anthropological method ripped them out and put them into a dance study and a drawer full of gambling materials and a shelf full of wax cylinder songs, when really they all need to be interrelated, the material and intangible cultural heritage. So that's what this project is about, and we have other examples at the book that I'd be happy to talk about later. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. That's an amazing presentation to hear about these fragments, the dispersal of the fragments. And I think when we're talking about performance history, also that travels, that is constantly traveling. There's that constant dispersal of the memories of performance in so many different places. So I think it's a challenge for thinking about the preservation of performance. That's something to talk about through the discussion. So we're just doing a technical switchover. Everyone cross your fingers. Yeah, okay. Something's happening. That looks right.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lara Wilson. I'm from UVic Archives and Special Collections, and I just want to begin by saying we at UVic are honored to be guests on the land of the Lekwungen people. The Songhees of Esquimalt and the Saanich, whose relationship to the land continues. I'm a settler Canadian. My family have been uninvited guests here since the 1940s, and they are from the Stoney tribe and Kwakwaka'wakw territories after immigration from Scotland, Ireland, and England. Theatre has been a part of the life of the UVic campus since the 1930s. And I say UVic, and this also includes Victoria College. They have a theatre and performance collections have a strong presence in our archival holdings. And those of you who were up at the library yesterday for the presentation that Jim Hoffman and I did, you've heard a little bit about this, but when I looked in our accessions database, we had over 70 accessions related to theatre. And this is just based on keyword searching, so that could certainly be refined with more analysis. But these materials in our holdings have been used for theatre history research projects and objects-based learning sessions for students in undergraduate and graduate programs over the last few years. And over the last couple of decades, UVic Special Collections and University Archives has taken on the preservation of local arts and cultural organizations in this area. A little bit about our institution. UVic was established as an independent degree-granting university in 1963. It was preceded by Victoria College in 1903, and Vic College was originally a college of McGill University and then the University of British Columbia, and within a number of different locations here in Victoria, including the historic Victoria High School and Craigier Castles. The Players Club was a part of student and faculty life here in Victoria College and the early days of the university. And our Victoria College ephemera collections includes Players Club pins, and we have annuals and so forth from that time. A little bit about the origins of our unit. Professor Roger Bishop was the head of the English department at Vic College and then UVic from 1945 to 1967. And theater and special collections were dual passions for him. And his contributions to the establishment of the theater department in 1966 are recognized in the 208-seat proscenium theater, which is called the Roger Bishop Theater. And his rare book and manuscript acquisition activities form the core of our special collections. So in the summers, he would travel with money, carryover money, and he would acquire rare print and manuscript materials. And his philanthropy has continued beyond his lifetime with estate gifts for an entrance scholarship in theater and funds for us to continue to acquire materials. So UVic Special Collections officially formed in the late 1960s, and UVic Archives in 1974. And our acquisition mandates have grown to include international and regional theater materials, arts and culture, as I mentioned previously, institutional and faculty records. Archives related to theater are found in our institutional records, our alumni materials, our faculty archives, and the records of persons and organizations in the community. As I mentioned yesterday, in the early days, our collections were reflected European and settler Canadian histories and traditions, and the collections include English and Anglo-Irish literatures, and special collections hold materials to Irish drama, and former faculty member Anne Saddlemeyer's poem reflect her research on Lady Gregory W.B. Yeats and the Yeats family. But related to more regional materials, we have fonds and collections that include the Players Club, the University Theater Department, the John Critch and Harvey Miller collection, so a collection from these two faculty members, very extensive. Carl Hare, who was an instructor and professor in theater from 1963 to 1984. William West, who was a professor and art instructor and set designer from 1964 to 1983. He also taught art at Oak Bay High School. Company One Theater, the New Bastion Theater Company, the Belfry Theater, Peter Mannering, who was an artist and producer, an actor and producer, Langham Court Theater, the Victoria Theatre Guild, and Kaleidoscope Theater. So the question one of the questions put this morning, tell us about one performance-related object in your collection. It's been up on the slide here for a few minutes. This is a costume design of Biddy Gaddy's. And it was for the character Irina from Chekhov's play, The Three Sisters. It's approximately 28 centimeters by 35 centimeters. If you can discern, it's made of multiple materials. So there's lace, there's velvet ribbon, there's, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, tulle. There's sketching paper and cardboard. The image is rendered with ink and watercolor. There's a staple on it, so the material samples have been stapled to the cardboard. And this was created for a Langham Court Victoria Theatre Guild production in 1974. How do I know that? Because it's not written on anywhere on this. It's because the Critch and Miller collection has programs from that production. So I was able to find that Langham Court produced Three Sisters in 1974. And the image is rendered from the front and the side to show details including the ribbons and the hair. So why did I choose this object? Well, it's multiple media, and it's an engaging object for students who are participating in objects-based learning sessions with our theater holdings. From my background in art history, I'm drawn to it because it's graphic material, it's an artwork as well as a design record. Interestingly, it was donated with very little supporting documentation. So presumably the notes from my predecessor who accepted this donation had the supporting facts which went into the biographical sketch. And another interesting point is that her archives are, when you delve into it, as I just mentioned, there's a connection with the Langham Court records. We have the Langham Court archives. It illustrates the closely knit theater community in Victoria. Biddy was born in 1919. Margaret Thompson Biddy McNeil, and she got a teaching degree from UBC. Her husband William and his twin sister Boyce were both faculty members at UVic. Bill was the chair of the psych department, and she was a volunteer costume designer for UVic theater productions from 63 to 70. So that's very interesting about women's labor in theater to me. She went on to do contract work as a costume designer for other production companies from 70 to 82, so maybe she was paid to do this work. It was donated in 2001, so her phone consists of 37 designs. It does also include some photographs by actor, director, and producer Peter Mannering. So we have Peter's archives, and Biddy's archives has some Mannering images, and a number of productions I could list here. This was the Three Sisters. She also did some very beautiful designs for Midsummer Night's Dream and the Renaissance 65 fair that was put on by UVic, and so forth. And her description is online through the Memory BC database and our database at UVic. So her volunteer work appears to be, it reflects the necessity and the spirit of the times, and certainly I'm sure that sort of collective work continues. Just a related note about volunteerism, that the Professor Carl Hare at UVic organized faculty, staff, and students to build the theater at one of the huts at UVic. So UVic is on the site of a former Army base. So that was a collective volunteer work. That was the first home to the theater department. And when you start with a single image like this in the community here that we have here, you can potentially trace the many connections through different persons and organizations associated with theater. So, and other figures in the arts and cultural scene in Victoria at the time. So interestingly, as I was preparing for this talk, I found that UVic's Legacy Gallery has an abstract ink work by Biddy. So she was involved in other art production, and that was a part of the Robin and Sylvia Skilton art collection. Robin Skilton was a poet and a founding member of UVic's writing department. He was a practitioner of Wicca and has established the Wicca community in Victoria. He was a member of the Lindner Society of Archivists. And he and Sylvia also collected Jacques Butler Yeats artworks, and Robin was also a supporter of special collections. So there's all these webs of relationships. So certainly this is potentially even a linked data project where one could to establish the relationships across Victoria and beyond through when you start with one image. So that's my
Thank
my
you.
presentation.
So next up we have Luann. Yeah. I think we're okay.
Lara Castalfla, Ikat Webaclan. Yayclan Laka Mama Lipla, through Wapagios. The Amkan, Lara Castlaka, the Pongan. The Ehish Galagachans, Conskalkelachok, a week of. So, in my language of Kwakala, I've introduced myself by one of my Kwakala names, which is Ikat Webaclan. I just mentioned that I'm from the Mama Lipla and the Quagil, Fort Rupert, Jacques. And also acknowledged and thanked the Lekwungen people for always making me feel so welcome in the land of their ancestors. So I'm really glad you read the questions again because I forgot them 5 minutes after she told me everything. But I think that I did end up magically bringing around my presentation. I just have about 4 pictures that I wanted to share. And the key message about performance and dance, especially. I've been working a lot, because I'm an initiated dancer within our traditions, I've been working a lot with our community. I've lived here in Victoria. Actually, this year is 50 years that I've lived in Victoria, so I discovered that last night on a walk. And it made me really excited to think that I've been here that long, but more importantly, part of a larger community of Kwakwa people who moved here in the late 60s and early 70s, not long after Mungo and the whole Hunt family was here, working here at the museum. Over the course of time, we have been really fortunate that Mungo built the big house that stands next to this museum. Watwadikwa is its name. And Mungo built that space so that all future generations would have an opportunity to have a space to learn our dances, our traditions, singing, speech making, all our customs, language. And over the years, we've taken full advantage of that and worked really closely in partnership with the museum. So when I used to run around here as a kid, when it was still the BC Provincial Museum, wreaking havoc, poking at that big canoe that they used to have in the lobby, I used to think one day I'd love to work here. Maybe I could get behind one of those glass cases and touch one of those blankets, because I always had an interest in making regalia for our dances. So one of the key points that I like to share quite often is that when we talk about dance, we're not always just talking about performance. It's not an automatic translation over to the idea of public performance or contemporary performance. But I think there's a lot of dotted lines that still need to be solidified, and that's going to happen through these kinds of discussions. Our ceremonies are our laws in action. It's the way we affirm and assert and practice and manifest the things that have been handed down to us from our ancestors. So the project that I fully intended to talk about with this image is this blanket, which is a chilkat robe woven by Anislaga, who was Mary Ebbets from the Tlingit people, and who married Robert Hunt, and they were stationed in Fort Rupert, at Fort Rupert. And through the course of time, their family grew, and Anislaga wove a number of blankets. This one arrived in our collection at some point. I didn't go into the history of that, because the point I wanted to make about it was this blanket, this precious robe, has always been made available back to the communities when they asked for it. And so for this photo, these are two descendants of Anislaga. And it was Chief Trevor Isaac, when he received his chieftainship, that contacted me and said, is there any way you can bring that blanket home? We want our ancestors dancing with us, my family especially, when I received my chieftainship. So I put up my hand right away and said, I'd be happy to take it. And so the conservators and several other members of our team helped me put it all together and wrap it up very carefully and bring it up to Fort Rupert, where it was danced by several of Anislaga's descendants. And this was really important. Everyone who danced it said they could feel that energy. It was about that reconnection with ancestral energy. And they were so proud. I ended up taking a lot of video, and a lot of young girls were really pleased and said, when I get a little bit taller, I'm going to dance that blanket. It's also actually been brought out a couple of times, and I've been very fortunate to be the one to take it out for several graduations of Anislaga's descendants. Dr. Margaret Wilson from the Wilson family at Fort Rupert received her doctorate in nursing last summer at UBC. So I had the good fortune of bringing it over to her. And while I was on another trip, another colleague also made the blanket available to Joy Wakas from Zopodi, from the Guatsla Nakota. And Joy wore it at her graduation at UVic for the, I think it's a Master's in Language Revitalization program. So it's really wonderful to see how these wonderful robes of powers, they're often called, and I can attest to wearing these and feeling the difference that it makes to have these. I wanted to share this picture because this is why we do what we do. This is why I do what I do. We've had several, like I mentioned, several generations that have actually learned to dance here on the grounds of the museum, partially because the house was made available to us, but also some of our own researchers in the community. They may not be taking any kind of formal post-secondary academic training at all, but they have a really good ear. People like Tommy on Katie's project have such a finely tuned ear to our music, and they've come into both the BC archives and into the Indigenous collections and listened to the recordings there in order to determine and help the museum determine where do these songs really belong, who do they really belong to, how many families are connected to these songs, and then how do we get a hold of them to let them know that we have them. And that's become part of my job under the repatriation umbrella. This young one was learning how to do the paddle dance. That's her first little paddle. And often when I first started carving with my brother, that was what we had to carve, was a cute little paddle like that. You saw in Katie's presentation there was a paddle dance. So that's what she's doing there as well. We do outreach. In fact, I'm heading off on Sunday to Vancouver for the First Nations Education Steering Committee. Is having a 2-day language conference on Monday and Tuesday, which is really exciting because we've just gone through the process of digitizing quite a few linguistic recordings that were recorded with our linguists back in the 70s and 80s, specifically for turning it into curriculum and back into the communities. But of course, budget cuts prevented that from being fully realized, but we're now able to do that. And we don't have to do the development, we just need to get the recordings back to the communities. So at the language conference, I'll be showing lists of the recordings that are digitized, those that are still in the collection but not digitized, and also having available lists that have restrictions. Some of the recordings are not open for the public or for just anyone to listen to because they might be sacred songs or sacred knowledge or secret knowledge, as Jerry was talking about earlier. We also go to Hobier, which I love. So I'm off to Hobier next week, which is the Nishka New Year at the P&E grounds in Vancouver. And then finally, when we were at Hobier last year, this elder, and I have a million stories about meeting with elders about our collections, was going through our photo collection. And what we've done is just digitized all of our photo cards for now so that we can get them as readily available as possible and so that we can put them on flash drives. All of the photos that are publicly accessible and have been okayed by the communities that they were taking up have given their permission for these to be shared out to their family members, to their tribal members. So I have about 500 flash drives with me that if somebody shows up to talk to me at OBA or at the language conference and we look through the pictures, I can pop it on a flash drive for them on the spot, which is really exciting because we've never been able to do that. And so I have a bazillion questions for Jerry about digitizing later. This elder found a picture of her father. And then her granddaughter came along later and flipped through and spotted a picture of an uncle. So, and these were pictures they didn't even know existed. So it's a real honor for us to be able to do this kind of work, share it back out into the community, and at the same time, when I come back into the office, then I'm also looking at things like, what does the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples mean? What does it mean about the rights to information? What does the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples mean? What does the TRC mean? And a lot of that, before I got to stand in this position, I was on the advisory committee for the museum, Indigenous Advisory, and we started working on changing our collections policy, which was previously the Aboriginal Material Operating Policy, and is now the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Policy. And we knew when we started off on this, it wasn't going to be perfect the first go-around, but somebody had to step forward and make a difference. That policy is actually on our website in the Indigenous section, so if you're interested in looking at how the policy reads, it's there now, and our council, I keep calling them council, our committee, advisory committee, will actually be going back and reviewing it again this year to make sure it's still accurate, because as we've gone through repatriation went from this, let's take these things and bring them home, and the priority was ancestral remains, and has grown, so that now when we talk about tangible and intangible, we're talking about the photos, the audios, and the few film recordings that we have. So the way the policy reads and how it fleshes out in everyday practice and who can access those collections is changing quite a bit. So I think that there's a lot more discussion for all of us to have, especially on the academic side, people doing research and continuing to work in our communities, and those communities who don't currently have policies. How can we assist them in aligning our policy with theirs and vice versa? So I'll stop there and then we'll chat some more about it. Bela Kessler. Last was a dancer at Hobia. He couldn't sit down and keep still.
Thank you, Luann. Next up, we have Michelle from the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria.
Excellent. Even though when you work for a public art gallery, it feels like you give your entire life to the institution, really I am much more than just the chief curator at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. So maybe I'll try and work some biography into my presentation. And actually I will admit that for many years I hated public speaking. And it was only when I figured out that I could make my presentations about myself that it became really bearable for me to do. So perhaps it's a blessing in disguise that I need to tell you about myself now. I came to the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria after living most of my life in Toronto. And just prior to coming here, I was the acting curator of Canadian art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And that position took me back to my schooling, to my training, where I studied historical Canadian art. And somehow after graduating from my master's in arts and art history, I never got a job in historical Canadian art. I always worked in contemporary art. And that might have something to do with the fact that my MA thesis looked at a Canadian artist, a historical Canadian artist from Montreal, a woman named Prudence Ewart, quite successful peer of the Group of Seven, who painted these incredible images, portraits of women. They were perceived to be very confident, unusual women for the 1930s, the period when Ewart was working. But within her larger output, there was a series of about 7 paintings that she made of nude black women. And unlike the confident, non-racialized women that Ewart painted, the black women always looked very dejected, almost mortified about their nudity. And sort of no art historian or critic had ever sort of noticed the countenance or the postures of these women. They always interpreted them as expressions of art history's opening up into a new era of race relations in Canada. So I wrote my thesis from the perspective of a black woman about these images, and I guess what I did was undermine the possibility of a career in Canadian art history. I was very critical of what all of the people who could have hired me had written about these paintings. So as a result, I ended up getting a job in the contemporary field where critique was more accepted. And one of the mediums that I became really interested in working with was performance art. And I won't, I've taken you back to 1993 by talking about my MA. I'll skip ahead to my work here in Victoria so that we can stay on time. So at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, we often work with performance artists who are understood within the sort of narratives of visual art. So I'm just showing a couple of images of works from a series that I did 3 years ago, which was called Making the Invisible Visible. And I was working with 3 senior women Canadian performance artists who wanted to work out in public space and sort of draw attention to some conflicted locations around Victoria. So Judy Price, who is local to Victoria, taught at Camosun for many years, taught performance art at Camosun College for many years. Did this project which takes as its site the gun battery at Macaulay Point Park, and she's choreographed a group of dancers to do what is essentially synchronized swimming moves that are mimicking the kind of semaphore communication that would have been used from that location when it was a World War II site, and they were communicating, the military was communicating from land to warships in the Pacific Ocean. Her colleague, Johanna Householder, worked up at, I've got the wrong title up there, sorry about that. Her colleague, Johanna Householder, did a project up at Swan Lake Bird Sanctuary. And this image is Johanna giving a lecture at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning where she's explaining human behavior to the birds. Her assumption was that at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning she wouldn't actually get a human audience, so she geared her performance to the birds that would be just waking at that time. But perhaps more connected to my art historical origins are the kinds of works that we do in the gallery working with performers to bring a different mode of expression to what is happening on the walls of the galleries. So I've got a couple of images here. This is Constance Cook's choreography. Laura Barclay is dancing, and they are in an exhibition of historical Canadian art. And perhaps a little cheekier, this is a piece, Let's Get Physical with Laura Gildner, where Laura Gildner choreographed a group of dancers sort of taking their inspiration from 1980s aerobics in an exhibition of Emily Carr's work. So the question was, what is the role of performance in your institution's collections? And I sort of answered that question in a roundabout way by thinking about how performance is used to trouble exhibitions that we create from our collections, which is something that I guess I have been doing for a long time, since my graduate school days. But a sort of another mode that we take at the gallery in terms of inserting performance into our work is thinking about the collections that we have that speak to histories of colonization and the notion that Western institutions really own a lot of things that they shouldn't. So this was an exhibition just last year that my colleague curated called Landscapes of Edo. And in order to speak to the fact that the collections of Japanese prints that we have really belong to a living culture, we will often do things like invite, in this case, the Umanari Taiko Drumming Ensemble to the opening in order to just sort of connect our audiences to the fact that they're not looking at long dead objects, that these objects are from very, very vital living cultures. And that's particularly important when we do exhibitions of Indigenous work. This was an exhibition called Form as Meaning, and we have one of the exhibition's curators, Neel, on the panel right here. She curated the show with Marcia Crosby, Les Lai, and Elena Sayers. And this is an image from the opening event where we had the Burundian traditional dancers welcome the exhibition and welcome audiences to the exhibition and share through dance and through storytelling a little bit about their cultures. And it's so interesting to me to think about how my institution actually fails in kind of documenting all of these projects, because all of the images that I just showed you were all from my iPhone. I could not for the life of me find any sort of formal documentation of these events in our database. So to go back to Sasha's question though, we do have a few examples of performance in our collection. This work, Artist Working Artist by John G. Beaumay, was actually commissioned by the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in 1998, and we acquired it, the artist donated it the year after I got to the gallery in 2013. And this is what we received, and this is more or less how we present it when it's installed, but originally the project was presented at the Art Gallery Paint-In, which is an annual event that attracts 30,000 people. And the artist was taking a cheeky position on the fact that this is a an incredible event that draws a lot of attention to the art gallery. It raises a lot of money for the art gallery, and the way we do that is to line Moss Street from Fort Street to Dallas Road with working artists, painters at their table sharing their practices with the tens of thousands of visitors. So John translated the work of the painter into the work of a performance artist / janitor, and spent the day durationally cleaning the street after the 30,000 people. So to conclude with Sasha's final question, which was why did I choose this object? Really, I chose it because, I mean, on the one hand, I would like to figure out how to encourage more artists who are working in performance or other more ephemeral practices to think about how their work can be represented in the HEGV collection. But I think more importantly, what this example has made me think about is how our strategies for preserving objects fail certain kinds of artists. And I just think there's such a disjuncture between the humor and action of John's original intention and the way the object now sits in our collection and looks in our database. So one of the things that I'm very excited about, is sort of at the earliest stages, is that I'm part of a network of people who are hoping to find the resources. That means we have the will but not the money. To start thinking about a different kind of museums, collections, database that would allow the emotion and liveliness and action and intention of different kinds of works to actually be preserved by the museum. And I think I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you all for those fascinating presentations and for sharing those stories. I'm struck by so many things when I hear these presentations together. And of course, I'm sure many of us are seeing some of the connections and resonances between what's being discussed. Maybe what I'll do is I can start with a question, but I also want time for our guests to ask questions as well and for us to respond to those. So I'll start with something and then I'll open it up to everyone. You know, what I'm hearing a great deal about is the challenges, the pleasures also, the necessity of making materials move, right? So in your presentation, Katie, the idea of this digital publication, right, which allows this fragmentary, the kind of fragments that are elsewhere to kind of come together in one space digitally. The movement of the blanket, right, beyond the museum space, trying to think about this moving performance within a database, and the very image that you showed, Lara, how it represents a kind of moving costume, right, a costume that exists in space. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about how we can make things move like that, the challenges in your work, Katie, of building that digital publication. Yeah, if anyone can speak to that.
Yes, it's hugely challenging. It's challenging for institutional reasons, right? To get the permissions to bring all of these things together. It's challenging as a researcher when you go in and you're looking through the database and, you know, everything that Boaz recorded in 1930 has a cataloging system with these numbers over here and those numbers over there, and none of them point to any of the others. You don't even know that they exist. So institutionally, getting all of those pieces and people and gatekeepers aligned is super challenging. I'm fascinated with what Michelle was talking about. Just, you know, it seems so boring to put up a picture of the database, but it's absolutely at the middle of what we struggle with too, right? How are we going to describe these things in a way that makes it accessible for community members to find them? How do we share this information? So I'm very lucky, I'm working on this digital book, and we've been working on it for 10 years, and it's going to take another year or more. And that's one film in our archives. Our archives has 50,000 pieces in it. Our cultural collection has 50,000 pieces in it. That's one piece. And so I'm demoralized by how are we going to bring these kinds of responsibilities to the other pieces in our collections, and how are we going to have the time and energy and money to make sure that we are, as an institution, are responding to, supporting, working with communities in all the ways that Luann is talking about, moving the RBCM forward to have this much greater understanding of what repatriation means, in terms of the intangible and not just those things listed under NAGPRA in the United States or other descriptions in Canada. So there's just so many challenges, but it's also phenomenally rewarding to see the pieces come together, to see, as you say, young children dancing again, learning on the museum grounds, to hear in our project Tommy Child bringing out new songs that have been quiet for a while, and other ways that that connects to current priorities on the ground in community.
Yesterday, when we were talking up at Archives and Special Collections at UVic, we had a discussion about digital preservation. And so from the point of view of archives, obviously digitization is one way to make things accessible. However, a colleague of mine here at RBCM the other day, her name's Amber, talked about how, I was at a meeting, and how digitization is one part of a process, like she said, like 1 centimeter in a meter of work that goes into the preservation and then maybe the integration into another program of that information and material. I'm fortunate to work within UVic libraries, and as I mentioned yesterday, I have the opportunity to work with many colleagues outside of our unit to talk about digitization and animation of the archives. But it is a very long process. We are seeing in academic libraries a shift in terms of the structure of the labor, because print materials are increasingly coming in with the cataloging is done for print materials, and therefore the work processes are changing, and there are opportunities to have library workers work collaboratively with the archives workers to create metadata and to make that information more discoverable. So that is an important opportunity right now.
Well, it's interesting too, hearing these discussions, thinking about networks. Who's talking about networks? I think we're all talking about networks. But as you talk about Peter Mannering's materials that are in the UVic archives, I started thinking, oh, Peter Mannering. Yeah, I was looking at the BC Museum website a couple of weeks ago preparing for this, and there's a whole bunch of oral histories, that were donated by Peter Mannering from BC artists that sit in the archives, and of course the links between those, right? You kind of have to, right now, you have to find and discover those yourself. And throughout the last 2 days, we've been having that discussion of those moments that we've sometimes been calling like, those like you found gold or something, which is so problematic, and we've just been discussing the kind of problematic nature of that sort of extractive approach to thinking about archives. But how we create those kinds of networks, I think, is part of this question around accessibility. Can I ask one more question before I throw it back? Thinking about those networks, I'm struck in hearing about, of course, provenance, right? How things got to to the place. And so we heard about Francisca Boas, we heard about Anne Sademeyer, we heard about Roger Bishop. And so it seems to me that these materials sitting in the institutions that you work in, right, are really tied to powerful voices, tied to institutional affiliation. And I wonder if anyone would also just like to talk briefly. We heard a little bit about it, but I think I'd like to hear more about it with, how you engage with communities to actually enhance your collections, not to just bring the collections to community, but to ask the community to contribute to the collections or not,
I'm not sure if this is going to answer the question directly, but this project that I'm working on to create a different kind of database that will be accessible in a different way. The idea is that it would incorporate strategies of artificial intelligence and computer-human interface to allow a different kind of search method, so that it's not about an expert coming in and knowing what they're looking for, but the database would actually be able to learn and start to incorporate the ways that layers and layers and layers of people have searched through it, if that makes sense. So the interesting thing is that it would become absolutely essential that it be a many-usered database. And right now, that image that I showed you of our internal database, it was supposed to be transformative, and really there's one person in our building who knows how to use it. And actually the Royal BC Museum stole our person who really knew how to use it. So now we have somebody who's learning how to use it. I think that that's essential, but that incorporating community knowledge is essential to making collections truly relevant. And I think that that's the key thing. Museums, other collecting institutions are in this process of moving from providing information for the expert to providing broadly accessible information that is widely relevant. And that's what will keep us functioning into the future.
We didn't steal. I just want to add a little partial thought to that. We're very much working on that here at the museum too, having to transfer all of our database that's been accumulated over the years into our new database format that is much more searchable. The part that I have my eye on is all of the renditions of our tribal names. There's probably 20 different ways to say Kwakutlo, Kwakil, and it goes on and on. And so it's really difficult for our own researchers in our own communities to come and visit us and find. I think the best example is the Tsimshian. It's this big, broad name that accounts for people with entirely different dialects amongst them, entirely different geographic locations for all of their historic villages, and the things that were taken from those places and brought here. Now we can't, I was just talking to someone the other day and I thought, I don't even know how to begin to tell you the needle in the haystack that you're up against. So the work that we have to do as an institution, working really collaboratively with communities to go through and sort those out, make them searchable as best we can. I think we've done a good job on some of them so far, but just looking at how long that takes and knowing that it's going to be maybe another lifetime or two of some really dedicated workers doing this work. I think the other part too is that we have to really put the emphasis on bringing community into these projects, not as advisors, as lead investigators, as partnering investigators. They're the ones with the knowledge, they're the ones that can pronounce these things, they have memory, they have family who can share in the memory of making all of those documents more clear, and also to be really clear about who they really belong to. We lost a lot of people through epidemics, entire tribes. We used to have 26 tribes, we have 16 now. So there were things that still within our legal system, Kwakwaka'wakw legal system, we were able to transfer them to distant relatives, but there are still descendants who now, those families are reviving again. We've got the fastest growing population. We want those youngsters to have what belongs to them. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I'm really glad that we stole from you. Sorry.
Are there any questions from? Yes, Lena.
I guess this is starting with a comment, maybe it's going to turn into a question, but building a lot on what Sasha asked and what you've been talking about, Luann, the reciprocity, the thinking of the institution's role not as a kind of a charitable giving to people that are impoverished in some way, but actually that this needs to be it's a reciprocal understanding that the institution is going to become better, and the things that are held, if they're still held, are going to become better. And I was thinking, as you showed the picture of the blanket, and you were talking about the people who wear it, who have their ancestors become present, and that the actions that you're taking now, with the people who are wearing that blanket, they are future ancestors who will actually, that blanket becomes more and more powerful through this practice. And so that isn't just a redress for the wrongs of the past, but it's actually really a huge contribution to thinking about what's the purpose of holding these objects. So that's really struck me as you were speaking, but I wonder if other panelists might also think about that reciprocity and the ways that the richness that comes from working this way.
I think I'm going to try to connect with what you said, because in archives and special collections traditionally we don't have a lot of practice of loaning materials so much, no matter what kind of evidence we're talking about. And so I think an openness to loaning, and certainly in our case at music, it's the recognition this is a teaching collection, this is why we have it. And having flexibility around those sorts of long-standing practices where the focus is preservation, but I think there's a middle ground to get to.
The question of what does it mean to hold these things? Why are they here? So what I run into is the public often says, well, as we were building the new work, which just opened last fall, are you going to have open storage? Is it going to look like MOA where we can see supposedly everything on view? And the answer was no. Even though publicly we keep talking about see through the book so you can see into, if there's windows on collections, but it's not like open storage. And one of the answers to that is having those collections accessible where people can come in and touch them and learn from them and work with them is incredibly important and at odds with the public exhibit model, right? So there's some balance there. But in my job, the balance on how is that research collection open that's where the scale lands. That's our responsibility, because it's all of those things that were ripped out of community due to all of the colonial histories we understand have a new life. We have to help them have that new life, what that is. And it's exactly what you said, the ability to have an impact right now, to, as that piece, to be the teacher, and Luann speaks of this so eloquently, I should give this over. But this is our role, right? We're colonial institutions. As much as we talk about decolonizing the museum, there are ways that the collections are always colonial collections. So the work that we need to do, whatever it is you want to call it, whether it's indigenizing, decolonizing, just working more ethically is to make sure that those new lives happen now, and then we can see what's the next generation. That also includes having a commitment to collecting contemporary artworks across the aesthetic spectrum, so that the next generation is going to come back in and learn from what's going on today. How do the arts answer questions that are being asked today, and how do the Luann looks at, how do the older pieces answer questions that she has right now as an artist. And I'll almost be shaking on for you.
Add 2 points to that. Absolutely. One of the biggest questions I've had since I was a kid about this place was, how come you guys only have old stuff? I'm from an artist family, and I couldn't understand, don't you want some new stuff? And are they more valuable? Why are they more valuable? And when are you going to start getting new stuff?
Yeah.
And then now that I'm here, I'm really loving the opportunity to have that discussion with our curators, and the fact that I have this really weird, this part of my brain is actually public admin. I study public admin and I'm an artist. So I love policy. And I want to know why our collections policy doesn't elaborate on that yet. So hopefully we'll have more discussions about that, because you're so right. What about the next generation? I mean, they're going to look at the same things I got to learn from, which I love, because my grandmother's pieces are here. But I would also like my nieces and nephews 3-4 generations from now to be able to see my work that I created for them, so they could learn from it. So yeah, we've got a long ways to go on that too. I'm getting tired.
Yeah, Jenny. First of all, thank you for such a wonderful panel. I've been thinking a lot about how you've spoken about accessible databases and accessible, that to digitize something is to make it more accessible, but also that those things have learning curves, and that you only had one person who knew how to use your database, who then got borrowed, moved, translated to another institution. So I was wondering if you could each take a few minutes to talk about your relationship with various publics or various communities in making your spaces accessible. Like what are the learning curves? What do the learning curves look like? What are the relationships that are happening there? Less about specific objects and specific people, but more about how are people learning your systems, especially as your systems change. How do the people who work with you and you learn your systems, and how do publics get to learn your systems? Those are really big questions. Take any piece of it or none.
Maybe I'll just start with a very short answer. The database that we have that nobody can use actually has a public interface component that a couple of years ago, maybe it was just last year, we finally bit the bullet, and even though we couldn't afford it, we bought it, and it was supposed to be transformative. Institutions around the world use this software called e-museum. And it's not transformative, which is what has now prompted this research project to create something new. I think that many years ago, most museums shifted away from the expert model towards the more visitor-centered model, and started doing exhibitions that were not art historical or expert-based, but often thematic, to create ways to allow broader engagement with exhibitions, and we've completely failed on doing that with collections. And in the case of my institution, we will have maybe 2% of the collection out at a time. So we're always making the argument that we hold this collection in public trust for the people of British Columbia, and we share maybe 40 40 things from the collection at a time.
Thank you. At UVic, we do it in this engagement and raising awareness. And I would say for archives, demystifying archives is what we're trying to do now. And do I say Clint here? Clint Hutzelak. So Clint has been our graphic designer for a series of publications that feature our rare and unique holdings. So we're fortunate in that our librarian came to us, Jonathan Banksman, about 8 years ago from the University of Toronto, where he had begun a publishing program that did these highlights from the collection. So doing those publications, making them free, I mean, we happen to have funds to do this, making them free, sharing them with the community, having them online is just one way. But also the very practical acts of connecting with faculty, bringing students in, doing object-based learning and other instruction about how to use primary sources, how to find this material. In archives, the presentation of our multi-level archival description has always been difficult because as a small part of memory institutions, that kind of software was prohibitively expensive because we have such a small market in those kinds of databases. So we use a database called Atom that's open source and that's discoverable. But also doing those instruction sessions where you tell people what multi-level description is and have that important explanation process around what archival materials are and the limitations of what we can do at the front end to tell them what's there. It is still a process of you have to engage with the materials, you have to I'm hesitant to use discover, but to use the materials and see what information is there, at the item level. So.
We're doing very similar things. We just, it's actually at the printer right now, we have a research guide that helps communities and those who are studying Indigenous communities how to make their way through our online database, the publicly accessible portion. And what we've also done is started to put placeholders within the database for things that have been removed that may have been there before, but for which we have consulted with those communities and they've told us we don't want those online available to everybody, sacred masks especially. So we've done that, and so we've created that guide. We also have a guide within the BC Archives that talks about how to go through that computer system and to discover things and also do that online. And for both guides, it's really an opportunity for community to have a look at what's held here, and if they want to see something in person, they can select all of that and then make an appointment to come in and see us in person, and then we'll have time to bring those things out for them to look at. And especially sound recordings, we have a space where people can listen to the sound recordings. So those two things, along with a newsletter that our department, the Indigenous Collections and Reconciliation, Repatriation, I must be getting hungry. Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department creates a newsletter twice a year. We put that online, so that's free to get online. And then finally, our Indigenous Repatriation Handbook. And all of these things are just piece by piece what we're developing based on recommendations that we got in 2017 when we held a repatriation forum and asked community, and community gave us a nice big checklist of things to do. So happily we're getting through that list, and as we create these things, people continue to give us feedback, and we're getting to be really good listeners to hear what people are saying. If they're still having trouble getting access online, how can we improve the guide? Because otherwise we would need thousands of staff just to constantly do that. And we still need people available when the appointments come in. So if you do end up going on to either of our online databases and you're trying to make an appointment, just know it could be a month or two before you actually get in. We're very short-staffed in those departments, but the staff we have there are absolute experts and love being able to make those things available to you for you to see in person.
As Luann was saying, as everyone's saying, listening is such an important part of changing the processes. And so at the Burke Museum, I work for a center called the Bill Holmes Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art. Quite a number of years ago, we started a grant program so we could support those community visits, right? People art supply, they get funding to come spend a week at the museum. But in listening to what people needed, we realized that, of course, that wasn't enough, right? There's many, many people for whom the museum is, a difficult place, hard to figure out the access. You don't want to come because it's emotional and off-putting, represents difficult histories. So we started doing more outreach, just as you talked about going in and doing outreach at these events, and listening and hearing, well, we need not only to come in and see your things, but we need support so that, to see our things, excuse me, we need support so that we can teach people not just how to make this basket, but how do we go and gather the materials and process them. So then our grants changed in response to that. You can get a grant to teach on the land in your community. You can have a master artist come and do a workshop at the museum with the historic things, and then pick out half a dozen things from the collection, which our staff then takes out to community. You can do a workshop in your community with youth, people who can't travel, elders, people who don't want to come to the museum. And then, but maybe at that moment, they start meeting people from the museum, and it becomes less intimidating, and we can learn so much more. So it's just this, it's not just the database, the database is a huge issue, but those iterative processes of making your programs and processes better and stepping away from that sort of academic model of, I'm going to think of this thing and offer it to you. So that's my hope.
I think we have to leave it there because unfortunately lunch is coming in. Fortunately, but unfortunate for those of us that still have questions. But I will say that, of course, lunch is actually for everyone here, so help yourself to lunch as it comes in. We are taking a break until 2:15. But please join me in thanking Luann, Katie, Michelle,